Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us over your lunch hour for another one of our WESC webinars. I hope everybody's having a great day so far. My name is Ali Ramsey. I am WESC's Executive Assistant and Communications Coordinator, and I'm so happy that all of you are joining us here today. Our topic today is really exciting. It's branding in the early stages and is presented by Dallas Price, Programs and Marketing Lead at Collabs. So if you have any questions for Dallas as we go through, please feel free to submit them in the Q&A box. You'll see that there on your Zoom. And also feel free to introduce yourself, tell us where you're from in the chat box as well. So as always, this webinar is being recorded and it will be available on our website by the end of the day tomorrow. So you will receive an email with that link. And with that, I'm gonna pass it over to Dallas.
Thanks so much, Ali. Super excited to be here, everyone. WESC has been a longtime partner of Collabs and has been a huge supporter of everything we do. And it's great when we get the opportunity to give back to WESC and give a little presentation here and there on a topic that might be near and dear to something Collabs does. So thanks so much, Ali and the team, for having me out. I'm just super excited to give this talk. I get to do lots of talks on like startups and market validation and like founder mindset and stuff, but my life started in branding. So it's always cool to get the opportunity to talk about something that's I'm super passionate about, that I think is a super important area, especially for early stage startups. Defining your brand as like a foundational aspect of your organization, I think is extremely important. So actually getting to talk about that, I don't get to do very often. So super excited. So I'm going to present my screen and then we're going to dive through. Not want to share that. Cool. So yeah, as Ali said, I am from Collabs. Collabs is a technology accelerator. So what we do is we work with early stage startups, helping them scale from idea to about $1 million in annual revenue. Just a little bit on the agenda today. I'm going to talk a little bit about myself, of course, because it's my presentation. I get to talk a little bit about myself. And then I'll talk a little bit about Collabs, and then we'll actually dive into branding, why it's important, why it matters in the early stages. And then I'm going to go through the process that I've worked with about 30 companies so far, in going from market research to working on messaging to finally working on the design of a brand. And then we got some time for Q&A, or feel free to just drop it in the chat at any time. Happy to just answer questions on the fly. I always find that's a little bit easier, and I would love to just not ramble for 45 minutes straight. So a little bit about myself. I actually started my life in the agency world. I co-founded a design agency called Press. We started out as like a full stack marketing agency doing everything. Truthfully though, we were just like a bunch of like 23-year-olds who had no real idea what we were doing. We rented like a fancy office, ended up in debt after the first year, and just kind of had no choice but to figure it out after that. So we've been running it ever since. Ran it full time for about 3 years, then ended up with an opportunity out in Vancouver, went out to Vancouver, and then finally ended up at Collabs. Over the course of that 3 years, we pivoted from being a full stack marketing agency to doing one thing, and that was branding for early stage startups. It's what we were always passionate about. It's what we were always good at. And actually in defining the brand of Collabs was a really interesting exercise in how we articulated what we did with our positioning, with our messaging, with the eventual design of the brand, and how that helped us really actually scale the business. So that's kind of how branding became such an important aspect of everything I do. And then I came on to Collabs about 1.5 years ago running marketing. I now also run our early stage programs, which I'll talk about a little bit. But yeah, I came on to do the rebrand for Collabs. I also did the rebrand for Uniting the Prairies. And then that translated into a bunch of other materials like both websites, sales and marketing decks, our social media, etc. And also feel free to add me on LinkedIn. It's where I'm most active. So if you want to reach out to me, I take 3 days to respond to emails, but like an hour to respond to LinkedIn messages. So just a little on Collabs, I'll just run through it quick so you at least have an understanding of what the organization is. So we work with high potential and high performing founders to take technology from idea to $1 million in annual revenue. Once you're at that kind of $1 million mark, you're ready to hit that Series A. You're probably scaling your team to 30 to 50 people, and you've kind of hit that ramp in your accelerating. But we run programming for all companies before that stage. So even pre-idea to I have an idea, we have programming to help you take that idea to eventually building an MVP, to beta testing, generating revenue, hiring employees, getting funding, scaling. We have a bunch of different programs to help that. And we just didn't talk about Collabs. We're an independent nonprofit, so we're entirely government funded. Everything we do is completely free and there's no equity. So if you ever see an event or a program or anything you're interested from Collabs, just know that we're not taking equity and there's no fees in what we do. So we have 4 programs. We have CoLearn, which is really helping people get that start in tech. People who are kind of unsure, don't really have an idea. It's kind of the basics of what is tech, how can you get into tech, how can you learn a little bit more, and how can you eventually hopefully start something. CoLaunch is our 12-week bootcamp program, taking companies from that like idea prototype stage to hopefully generating revenue. We actually have the CoLaunch finale going down December 9th. So that's next Thursday. If you're free, we're at Prairie Led Park. Highly recommend coming out and seeing some of the founders pitch. Then we have our 2 residency programs, CoLink and CoLead. Those are all about taking you from that kind of first time of generating revenue to hopefully reaching that $1 million mark. That comes with office hours of mentorship from some of the top executives and individual contributors at tech companies in the city. We have an expert program where we actually hire people to work directly in companies on 10 to 15-hour projects. And then you get office space and just a host of other resources. But that's enough on Collabs. I also want to talk a little about layout. So it'll kind of preface most of what I do in the branding world is actually with Layout Press, not too much actually with Collabs. Obviously, I help a ton of startups with Collabs, and there's some crossover, but the main in-depth branding work I get to do is actually with layout. As I said, yeah, we're a design agency. We work on brand strategy, content, and identity systems, mainly for startups in Canada, but we do have some global clients as well. And it's all about helping bridge the gap between how you're currently perceived and how you'd like to be perceived. Some of our clients, Collabs and Up, and then just a bunch of other startups that have been in the ecosystem for a while. I wanted to prove that I know at least a little bit about what I'm doing. So I added this GIF that I think is pretty cool of just some of the projects we've done, different technology startups. Some of these are actually traditional businesses as well. So I just wanted to include a little bit of what the end product actually looks like when a brand is executed well. So I just wanted to start off with, like, what do I actually mean when I say branding? Branding can kind of mean like a bunch of different things, and it kind of can be perceived as like your logo or some of your brand assets, your brand guideline, or like some metaphysical idea of what you want your company to be. But when I'm talking about branding, what I'm really talking about is kind of 2 different ideas. One is a brand is the sum of all the touch points you have as an organization with your customers. So a touch point can really be almost anything. It could be your social media, it could be email marketing, even breaking down like a Collabs event. You know, when they enter the building, are we greeting them how we'd like to greet them? What is the food that we're offering? Who are the speakers? What kind of materials, like sales and marketing materials, do we have at these events? All of these are individual touch points which either meet, exceed, or don't meet the expectations of a customer. An example I like to give is if you're looking at like a grocery store, Whole Foods and Walmart have entirely different brands. If you go to Walmart and you get pretty bad customer service, you almost expect that at this point from Walmart. But if you went to Whole Foods, you would expect exceptional customer service. So if you go to Walmart and you get bad customer service, you don't really care because that's really what you've expected. And ultimately the brand and your expectations are then aligned. Whereas if you go to Whole Foods, you're expecting kind of that exceptional service, you know, well-lit place, clean, looks great. And if you were to go there and receive not so great service, your expectations wouldn't meet. And that's where there becomes an issue with brand. And that's where it leads to my second point is that your brand is an external perception. You don't actually get to own your brand. It's how other people view it. If you view yourself as the market leader and the highest quality product. I mean, you might in fact actually be the highest quality product. If you look at like the automotive world, probably the most dependable car is not actually viewed as the most dependable car. It all comes from the external perception. So generally brand legs reality. If you have an exceptional brand, you can screw up a few times before it really starts affecting your brand. But ultimately, your customers determine what your actual brand is. And branding is the act of then shaping that overall perception. So why does branding matter? I'll start a little high level and then I'll get to some more like actual tactile matters. So with branding, there's really two building blocks on what a great brand does. What a great brand does is it ultimately creates trust. If you have customers, they have a certain belief about your organization, you meet those beliefs, you are continuing to create that trust. And especially in the early stages, what you can do with having a great brand is very quickly communicate who you are as an organization, what you do, how you do it, why customers should care about you, why they should choose you. When your brand is really dialed, that's where you can start creating trust right off the hop. And then because in the early stages, you're going to have less marketing dollars, you're going to have less brand awareness, less people are going to know what your organization is. So it's extremely important to create trust very early on, especially because you probably won't have the brand recognition or the name or the traction that some of your competitors do. So in creating trust right off the hop with a well-polished brand can really go a long way in the early stages. And the other part is creating community, rallying like your customers and stakeholders around a common problem, the problem you care about, the problem that's really essential to your organization. That's really how community gets created. And in the early stages, having that, like, if you've ever seen, there's an article on like 10,000 fans, for example, like creating that community in the early stages really helps in taking your brand from where it's starting at the early stages to have those kind of dependable fans who you know care about your business and can continue building upon that. So we had one question. No. Okay. Moving on then. So moving away from like the high level of like why branding matters, I wanted to create this presentation to be like as actionable as possible. So hopefully by the end of this, you'd be able to go not only from, you know, understanding what branding is and why it might be important, but actually start making some changes in your business to create the brand that you're looking to create. So from a functional perspective, the most important aspect of branding is what's called positioning. Positioning is becoming a bit more of a hot topic as just more companies get started, more kind of confusing products come out. It's never been more important to have a clear position for your product or for your startup in this case. And when you really get branding right, positioning becomes a little bit easy. For example, with Leo Press, when we started out as a full stack marketing agency, our positioning was almost impossible. Basically, what our messaging was that we worked with anywhere on anything marketing related. It becomes very hard for any customer to like really care about what you're doing or really understand who they should be referring to you or what you're best at. But as soon as we dialed into having this positioning of branding for startups, the value prop became very clear moving forward because we were the only people who were saying we only do this one particular thing. So when we were competing against, say, a marketing agency that wanted to do branding, but they also quoted on social media and SEO and website, some customers sure want all of those things together. But when it came to just the branding, we basically said, hey, this is all we do all day, every day is for your type of the type of customer you are and the type of project you want. This is all we do. So we had very unique positioning in the market compared to a lot of the other people, a lot of the other players in the market where they were kind of all encompassing. The next part of why it's really important to have branding set up and from a foundational aspect is having clear communications. Like I've said, it's never been noisier with the amount of startups and new organizations created. So the more you're able to clear in on your messaging, the better, especially in the early stages As you see it scale and start adding employees, it's never been more important that everybody is telling the same story in your organization. So you have multiple people in your organization. Do they pitch your organization differently? Do they think your value propositions are differently? Do they understand who your target customer is? It's never been more important to have all of those aspects aligned. And then finally, one of the biggest benefits of having a well set up brand is it makes marketing and generally sales like 10 times easier in creating any sort of like assets or copy or anything. If you have a clear brand guideline, creating something like a website becomes 10 times easier because you already know what colors you're using. You already know what fonts you're using. You already know what design elements you're using. There's none of this like argument around what font should we use, what pictures are we using, what are the design elements that we end up using, what's our slogan, what's our about us. All of this is already defined. So when you have multiple team members, it becomes just a lot easier to keep everything cohesive. And ultimately, one of the most important aspects of branding is this cohesion in the brand, where whether you see yourself on social media, whether you look at somebody's website, whether you have a conversation with them, the brand matches up, and it's very cohesive. So we have one question here. Oh, never mind. Okay, so that's it from a functional perspective. So what's the actual process? I think I've talked a little bit about then why branding is important, a little bit about why it matters, but like, cool, like how do you actually get that done? So there's three main steps in creating a really solid brand. Most people, when they start thinking about branding, what they do is they go design a logo. And that's cool, but that's not really where you should start. And without having kind of a framework, what you end up with is a logo that you think looks good, which is cool. But ultimately, we're not trying to make things look cool or look pretty or appeal to yourself. What we're trying to do is one, create very clear branding and clear messaging. But what that's going to end up doing then is set the foundation moving forward. And it's not about then making things look pretty. It's about what's the business case for how are we going to drive revenue and how are we going to scale our company. So the first step is market research. What you're doing here is you're talking to your customers. You might be doing surveys. You might be doing competitor analysis, analyzing industry trends. And what you're trying to do there is not from a product perspective necessarily, but from a brand perspective, figure out where you fit into the market. How are your competitors communicating is super important. What do your competitors look like? What's your unique value proposition over those types of organizations? Figuring that out, getting some of that research down is going to be extremely important in the early stages, because if you just start trying to write copy or you just start moving on to design, you're really missing the core essence of branding, which is figuring out what makes you unique. And if you're not doing the research to dial in on that, you're really just jumping around and kind of guessing at that point. The next step is then messaging and positioning. What you're doing here is creating what we call the verbal identity. So this is how your brand communicates. It's going to be, what's your tone? Are you funny? Are you interesting? Are you direct? And then also figuring out kind of what are your key messages and what are your value propositions. So when you have your value propositions laid out, everyone in your organization then knows what those unique values are, what those core values are, and can start building upon those. If everybody's communicating what you do very differently, it gets very confusing for customers. If somebody in marketing describes the product one way, then somebody in sales describes it somewhere differently, and then customer success explains it somewhere else, it becomes very confusing to the customer. So having those key messages written out really aligns everyone in the organization. And then finally, the last step, which is probably the fun step, is like creating the actual brand identity, which is the design side of things. So that's where you're creating your logo and your color palette, but then you're also creating the guidelines. How do you utilize that logo? Can you change the color of the logo? Can you flip it on its side? There's all these different aspects you can look at with identity design. But again, you're still looking to have that cohesion, and ultimately it comes back to you're building on each of these steps. So market research, you're figuring out, okay, what do all our customers look like, and where is our core value a little bit differently? Then your messaging is building upon that and really solidifying that core value. And then your identity design is just building on that messaging and figuring out, okay, so we're trying to communicate that we're a tech-centric organization. How can we create a visual identity that then showcases that tech-centricness? So little notes on branding here before I really dive into things. Branding is different for every organization, and the importance of it is a little bit different as well. And when I look at this process, I look at it as like an iterative cycle. Like if you're just starting out and you know a web page because you're going to like some pitch competition or something, the amount of time you're going to spend on this branding is probably pretty quick. You're probably going to try and do it in like an afternoon or something, versus if you're scaling to maybe like that $1 million mark and you're adding employees like crazy. What the amount of time and effort you're going to spend on your branding then is differently. So what we're always trying to do is create like our minimum viable brand. So what are the minimum elements that are necessary to get us off the ground and hit to that next step? So we're going through market research lightly, going through a bit of messaging. Okay, now we have everything set up to get our first logo designed and get our color palette and typography. Great, that gets us off the ground. And then if you're adding more employees, scaling a little more, it's probably time to go redo that process again. Dive deeper into market research. You probably have more customers. You probably change your positioning slightly. You probably have different core values or maybe more concrete core values. Then you can go back to design, improve the brand, so it then more solidifies those messages. And then, yeah, the importance, like if you're a D2C company that's scaling, I don't know, that runs like a ton of Facebook ads, for example, branding is going to be just like extremely important because you have so little contact with anybody that everything needs to look incredibly clean, and there needs to be like a lot of trust created incredibly quickly. Versus if you're doing enterprise sales, so much of that like sales cycle is done face to face, in person. It's a lot of talking, so it's important to have like still messaging and stuff aligned, but creating like an amazing brand for a company that does like amazing identity design for a brand that mainly does enterprise sales probably isn't really necessary off the first part. There's probably things you need to focus on more before you really start diving into identity design. So the first step is the foundation, which is market research. I talked on it a little bit, but with market research, this is really where people screw this process up, is they don't do market research. They don't even begin to look at what our competitors looking like, what are our customers saying about us. And what happens then usually is your branding just falls in line with everybody else in the industry, and you all sound the same, you all look the same, and you have no real differentiation. If you can find a few elements where everybody communicates the same and you can figure out how to communicate slightly different, or maybe a little bit more truthfully than your competitors, in this market research, you can really pull out those key elements as to where everybody looks the same and you might be able to look differently, or where everybody looks the same and you should still look the same, because you don't want to ruin the perception of your customer. So there's a couple different ways to do market research. My favorite way will always be just simply talking to customers. Your customers, your users, they're going to understand your brand way better. And what you're really diving into there is a lot around what your value proposition is. Why are they actually buying from you? Why do they continue to use for you? What do they think about like how you communicate? And then like get them to like pitch your product back to you. When you're doing work like that, it becomes very clear where there might be gaps, or if your customers are perceiving you differently than you expected. Surveys is another way. I'm not a huge fan of surveys. I'm not also a huge fan of focus groups in the early stage. This might be if you're like a really well-off brand and you're quite far along, it might make sense to do focus groups. But in the early stage, I think you really need to focus on these two elements here, which is desk research, which really you're analyzing the market. You're diving in deep into like industry trends, how people are currently looking at the market. And then, oh, we do have a question here. So we have a question here from Suzanne. She says, "Hi, Dallas. Thanks for all this. I was wondering if you thought the first question is who I am and what do I want to do, internal focus versus who is my dream client and what can I do for them? Ooh, good question. So on this question, are you focused internally as to who I am and what do I want to do, or the external focus? So with branding being externally perceived, I always try and do a little bit of the like fake it till you make it in this situation. So it really depends on what your goals are. Like if right now your organization is kind of where you'd like to keep it, that's one thing, versus if maybe you're like a technology company that's looking to scale rapidly. In that situation, you're more selling the vision, the long-term vision as to what's happening, versus if you're the mom and pop shop that is just looking to grow revenue maybe 10% a year or something like that. That's a little bit more on the like who I am and what I'm doing right now versus the like who I am and what my vision is long term. So we can discuss that a little bit later, Suzanne, but I appreciate the question. And then finally, my last type of research, which I think is the most important type of research, is competitor analysis. So if I look at for Collabs, when I first started, what I started diving into, I'll actually bring this up. This is an Airtable I created, is I really dove deep into all of the competitors that I could find in the market. So figured out who they were, figured out what category they labeled themselves as, what the value propositions they communicated as. But then I really dove into like the brand side of things. So what is their primary color? You can see that there's really no trend here. Everybody kind of does a little bit of everything. Secondary color, same thing. There wasn't really too many trends there. But if we look at something like font usage, we could see that everybody used a sans serif font. So that was really interesting to analyze, because you could look at it as like, okay, we're like tech centric. Typically, those types of companies would use sans serif fonts, but maybe if we really wanted to stand out, we could use a serif font, and that would then create like a really different image than most of the other organizations we are competing against. Then I would look at like, what are the specific fonts they're using? How do they use brand elements? Then I was looking at like image style and image quality. And this was actually a trend that I picked out here, was that the brands that really looked great and resonated would use live photos that were high quality. So they would use, they wouldn't use stock photos. They would use photos of events or people in their space, and they were really high quality photos. This made the brands really come to life. So this was something I really wanted to focus on at Collabs. Then I would look something like, how do they communicate? Do they communicate more about themselves, the startups, the community? What's their brand tone? Are they inspiring? Some of these came off as a little dull, but we would look at all these different elements and begin to analyze what are the trends, where are there places where we can stick out a little bit, and where does everybody kind of communicate the same that we can look at a little bit differently. So back to my presentation. So that's market research. So from that, you should be able to pick out some trends. You should understand your value propositions a little bit better. And you should understand what other people, what other brands are doing in this space, and which ones are falling flat and which ones are standing out. And then that leads us to messaging and positioning. This is what we consider the verbal identity of the organization. The design identity would be the visual identity. This is the verbal identity. So this is how do you communicate? So this is everything from, again, your value proposition. So this is where you start writing out your value propositions, really making them clear, really understanding what makes you unique as an organization, and how are you going to articulate that? What I see a lot of is everybody who has the same value propositions in an industry. We're the fastest, we're the cheapest, we provide the best customer service. What makes brands generally stand out right now is when they pick one particular value proposition. So for example, I could use Leo as an example for this. With our branding, all we really focused on was making sure that whenever we designed something, it looked great. As an organization, we didn't turn around projects the fastest. We definitely weren't the cheapest. The only value proposition we focused on was we have really good design, and then we let everything else fall by the wayside. And what that did is it then created like really unique positioning that here's an agency, all they do is branding for startups, and they do really good design. They don't turn around projects quickly. They don't really do it super cheap. But that created like a very clear value proposition. If you look at something like, I was working for like a logistics organization before, and literally everyone communicated the same. It was, we're the fastest, we're cheap, we provide exceptional customer service. But there's nothing interesting about that. If you were just to be like, we are by far the fastest organization, we get your stuff there quicker than anybody else, instantly, then if you're a customer who is looking to get something done as cheaply as possible, you would rule them out, and that's fine. There's millions of different types
Hey,
of.
Alice, we can't see your screen.
Oh, sorry. Are we good?
Yeah, we're good now.
Okay, thank you. So yeah, when we're discussing value propositions, yeah, are you the fastest? Are you cheapest? So if you were to then use your value proposition as we are the fastest, if you were a customer looking to get something done the cheapest, you would instantly rule yourself out. And there's a million types of logistics organizations, so there's more than enough work to go around. All you're doing then is creating a very unique position where if somebody were to be looking to get something done the fastest, they would instantly know you're the name to look for. And it becomes a lot easier to like have referrals, really easy to stand out in marketing because you have that one particular value proposition. Next after that is you're then creating the mission for the organization. This is where you get to go like a little bit crazy, articulate the change you want to see in the world. And then we get into your core values. Core values are really what your organization is going to live by, what are your guiding principles, and make sure that you never break those guiding principles. Then we get into a little more practical side of messaging. We start diving into things like your voice, your tone, and your feel. So as an organization, how do we communicate? What's our style? Are we funny? Are we direct? Are we interesting? Are we inspirational? This will help you start creating copy for social media, for your website, even in direct conversations with sales conversations. When you define your voice, it'll basically set you up there to then start writing copy better, and also frame some of those conversations. Next after that is you can start working on your slogan. This is really what your company does. And you see with slogans, it kind of goes a bunch of different directions. Like you look at something like McDonald's, they have a very particular slogan, but it doesn't really actually say what they do. It really has nothing to do with making hamburgers or fries or anything like that. It's all about kind of an experience, versus if you look at kind of how software companies create their slogans, it's very direct as to what they do. And really that just comes from a difference in brand awareness, and kind of how noisy the industry is. And then the final element you might want to look at for messaging is your elevator pitch. This is describing who you are, what you do, who you do it for, and why your customer should choose you. If you can do all of that in under 2 minutes, that really sets a frame of reference for your customers, and everyone in your organization can then use that elevator pitch moving forward. So then this leads us to kind of the fun part of everything, which is actually taking our messaging, taking our market research, really understanding those value propositions and how we can use design to make those value propositions stand out. So the first thing I want to say about design is that it's a system. People kind of like see a logo they like, and then a font they like, and maybe some colors, and they start trying to put things together, and they don't blend well together. One of the favorite brands I ever created was the Uniting the Prairies brand. And with that, I never actually thought the logo was all that great. It was a pretty basic logo, but all the elements around that logo ended up looking great. So it didn't need to have this crazy logo. What the logo needed to do is just clearly explain what this conference was, or that it was a conference, that it was up. People knew what that was at this point. It had enough brand awareness. So we just wanted it clean. We didn't want it to be like illegible and cool. We just wanted it to be clean, and then let all the other elements stand around. So this was a marketplace for ride sharing that we created. And really we started looking at what are all the different elements and how are they going to work together. So we're using here like a pretty bold font to make sure that things stand out because we thought that print would be an important aspect. So you'd be creating flyers, you'd be creating billboards. So we really wanted a bold font, but we didn't want to go too crazy with the color palette. We're using like a little bit of muted tone, so it's still bright and kind of colorful, but it wasn't so crazy that it would distract from that bold font. And then if you look at the logo, we created something that was a bit more unique with like a serif font there. And kind of the reason behind that was that we wanted something a little bit more distinct because we never thought the logo would be front and center. It would always be more the messaging that would be front and center, and the logo would be kind of like an auxiliary element. So the first part of creating a design identity is working on your logo. So in the early stages, the biggest mistake I see is people create crazy logos, and it becomes very hard to then apply those logos. So whenever I'm looking at the early stage, I'm always looking at either a word mark or a combo, which is generally like an icon with a word mark. When people go like way too crazy with like a mascot or an emblem, until you kind of have the financing necessary to create like a really good logo and a really good identity around an element, I would always recommend sticking pretty simple. And in fact, with a word mark, most people can actually create a word mark by themselves. They don't even kind of need a designer. So if you're really looking to get something off the ground, a word mark is a great place to start, especially when you're trying to build brand awareness. It's clear what this company is. They're Wix, okay, you at least know their name. But if you look at something like a symbol or an abstract, you don't even know. Like if you were to see this on a billboard and material, you might think it's interesting, but you wouldn't even know how to Google it, right? So that's where something like a word mark can be super useful. And when you're looking to basically design your first logo, logo is kind of the hard part of things. It usually takes a little bit of artistic skill that some people might not have. So there's a few different ways that I recommend getting references. One website is Behance. It's pretty much like social media for designers. You can basically search, if you go back to this slide and you see a particular type of logo you like, what you can do is you can just search that type of logo on something like Behance. Dribble is very similar, where these are pretty much, yeah, like social media for designers. And you can search those types of marks and you can start looking for references that you think look really great. Then when you want to get that like logo actually created, if you're doing a word mark, you might want to just try it yourself. If you're going for something a little more sophisticated, there's a few different ways. There's, of course, your freelancer sites like Fiverr and Upwork. I personally have not had very much luck working with those types of organizations. It's usually very transactional relationships, and it's very hard to get kind of exactly what you're looking for. So a site that I do like is 99 Designs. This is where you can actually run a competition for creating logos. So you can create a budget, say $500 is pretty reasonable. And basically a bunch of designers will come back. You can create a brief for it, and a bunch of designers will come back with logos they've created for your organization. And all you have to do is pick the best one. So I find that's a great way to work. Also working with local freelancers, I think, is a great point as well. Those relationships are usually less transactional and you can dive into things a bit deeper. So those are the two ways I recommend creating logos in the early stage. The next element you're going to look at is your typography. So there's two main types of fonts. There's something called a sans serif font, which is generally a digital font. What these are is they're generally cleaner to look at. They're easier to read. And so usually if you're like a very digitally focused brand, you're going to be online a lot. You're focused on social media, your website. What you're going to really look for is usually a sans serif font that's clean, because you want it to be as legible as possible. If you go into like a serif font, you have like a body font that's a serif font, it becomes very hard to read and a little distracting. My two favorite ways to find typographies that I like, this is a brand called type.io. They basically put font pairings together. So you'll be able to browse different types of fonts that are actually put together. So it'll give you like a body font and a heading font. So you already know what combination works well. You can always tell when somebody like pick two fonts they like, but don't actually work together. So this is like really good pairings. The other one is Font Space. Font Space has tons of fonts, but also a ton of not very good fonts. So when looking at these types of fonts, it's really important that you kind of stay grounded with it. Like it'll take you a bit longer, but they have a ton of different options. And the other consideration with typography is that you're going to want to look at either like Google or Adobe fonts probably to start out with, as other fonts can get a little expensive. Next element I'm just going to talk about is your color palette. Your color palette is really going to be a primary reflection of your organization. So with Collabs, what we wanted to focus on was that we're like tech centric. And with that, what we've seen with a lot of like really blossoming tech companies was this like bright, vibrant color palette. Do you remember before Collabs had like this dark gray and like a maroon, which was an okay place to start, but it didn't really look like a tech brand. So that was something we wanted to change. And instantly when we increased the vibrancy of the color palette, it made us look a lot more interesting. So there's two different sites I really like for finding different colors. There's something called Colors with two O's. And what they are is they basically create just different color palettes and you can flip through them really quickly. You can also search if you already have like one color you really like, you can search that particular Pantone, and it'll give you other fonts to pair with it. There's actually an Instagram account called Colors Cafe, which basically has a bunch of different font pairings has a bunch of different color pairings together. So you can look at kind of what works really well together. And the more you can get an entire color palette all together, the easier it is to then create a brand that's a little more cohesive. When you start picking a bunch of random different colors, you can end up with something that looks a little odd at times. Another element to think of when looking at colors is, does this color exist in real life? If you look at all of the Collabs colors, none of these are actual like real life colors. They're all digitally created colors. So if we were a brand that did a lot of print, which we aren't, we're focused a lot more on digital. But if you're a brand that focuses a lot more on print, you're going to want to focus on a color palette of colors that translate well to the real world and in print, which is something that like when you see us with printed materials, they generally look a little bit odd because the color palette is significantly different in real life. And the last element I'm going to touch on here before we move into Q&A is once these elements are defined, once you've done your market research, you have kind of clear messaging, you have your design system laid out, the next step is creating extraordinary brand touch points. So this is finding out those like 2 or 3 brand touch points that you can really make extraordinary. So for Collabs, for example, we were really looking at making the website stand out. And the reason was that so many people went to our website. We're a digitally focused brand. Our website previously was not very good. So we thought this was an element to really create something that when you went to it, it was very clear what we did. It looked great. It had clear communications. You could figure out which program was for you. So this was something we really wanted to improve. Another example of this would be like Hilton hotels. If you've ever went, a lot of them, the DoubleTree brand, I believe they give you like a warm chocolate chip cookie when you enter. And the reason is they wanted to make it seem like you were coming home when you went to Hilton. So they didn't focus on the rooms too much. They didn't focus on their food menu. What they wanted to really focus on was when you arrived, they wanted you to feel great. And what that's doing is it's creating a really easy referral point. So that's a really interesting story. That's something you can share with people that comes off really well. And that's just this one way of finding like one extraordinary touch point that can then become this element of sharing that can end up turning into a bunch of referrals. So just to finish off here, as a marketer, I always have to do a little bit of marketing. So our CoLaunch program, we have applications opening up on January 4th. All you need is an idea to apply. And this is our free 12-week bootcamp that works to take you from idea to revenue. And with that, we give away $20,000 at the CoLaunch finale. And we also have the Co-Learn Founder Summit, which is all about the basics of becoming a founder. And that's coming up at the end of January. I have my contact info here. If you have any questions, we can open things up now.
If anyone has a question, feel free to put that in the Q&A box or in the chat box, and Dallas would be happy to answer. If not, if you think of anything, Dallas's info is just up on the screen there, so I'm sure he'd be happy to answer anything if you think of it after the fact. Oh, it looks like we have one here.
Great presentation. Oh, I'll just throw my email in the chat here.
Perfect.
I'm always happy to talk about this stuff. If you have any questions, have any ideas, want me to look at your brand, more than happy to set up some time to talk about these things.
Okay, well, perfect. Thank you so much, Dallas. And thank you to everybody that joined us today. As a reminder, this will be up on our website, and you will be able to view that by the end of day tomorrow. We do have a webinar coming up on Thursday, December 9th, and that is Business Plan Basics. So if you haven't signed up for that, please do so at west.ca/events. Looks like Carla did have a quick question here. If you want to check that out in the Q&A box.
My question is, how do you transition from old to new look while keeping cohesion? A new color palette. Yeah, so when you're doing a rebrand is like a whole kind of new thing. Yeah, when you're creating that brand from the ground up, you really get to kind of design it however you'd like. But yeah, when you're doing a rebrand, what you want to do is at least keep the value proposition cohesive. So again, I mean, I kind of harp on this a lot, but it's really where everything fundamentally starts, is understanding that value proposition. So if you understand your value proposition, then what you're going to try and figure out is like, how do we keep the value that people like while still building for the future? So if you're looking at that situation, oh, okay, sorry. We have my contact info in the chat now. Okay, cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, so like when you're moving from old to new, it really becomes like, what's that key element that people loved? So for Collabs, it was like our events. Everybody loved the events, so we didn't really change too much on there, but nobody was really crazy about the logo or the color palette or really any of the elements. So we knew we had kind of full bore on that. But yeah, like if you have kind of those like iconic colors, you probably won't want to change those too much. Or you might want to just like change them slightly. So if you are known, if you have like good brand awareness and maybe your core color is orange, you probably don't want to switch to being yellow or switch to being blue. You probably want like a different shade of orange that's just like a little bit more modern. Typography, you can usually change quite a bit. And then logo, if you have any sort of like icon or element, you might want to just like refresh that icon or element, not kind of either like redo it or add a new element or anything like that. You'll probably want to keep it fairly standard, just like a light refresh. Yvonne said 7-Eleven has not changed its brand in 35 years. I think it's because they have an incredibly clear brand. You know, they're open 24/7. You know, they have great Slurpees. They don't really need to refresh too much. They do have like new design elements, like they changed the design of their Slurpee cups. Maybe I'm giving too much away and saying I know that they changed the design of their Slurpee cups. But yeah, like with 7-Eleven, they probably just had like a very clear brand and had great brand awareness, and their core customers liked what they do. So they probably have never really felt the need to refresh. There's also like an element of nostalgia that some brands have that you'll want to keep. And yeah, like I don't think you need to always update or redo your brand if it's working well and there's that kind of clear cohesion. Janice, could you tell me what your business is? That might help me in kind of defining a little bit onto what channels I think would be useful. If not, for Sudoku company. Okay, so you're online. You're probably going to live online. Yeah, so like social and ads are of course going to be important to that brand. But yeah, you can tap into the local area. Obviously, COVID makes this a little bit weird, but like events might be a great opportunity. I'm a big fan of like Facebook groups right now. I think it's really easy to build like a unique little community on Facebook. So if you were to then create like a little Facebook group for like people who love Sudoku in Saskatoon, you could create little meetups. You could create little competitions. Maybe you could have like a little event, something like that. We were actually getting some live activations, some people meeting in person is usually a great way to kind of enhance the brand. And that's where you can create like an actual community. And when you're just online all the time, it's very easy to fall out, to churn, to not really focus on something. For example, like I play a lot of chess, but I do so online. So it's easy to just like not think about it too much. But if there was like a chess meetup or something that I was involved in, then I have a set of friends, then I have a sense of community. So something like that, I think like a community aspect would be super cool.
Do we have any last questions here? We did post Alice's email address in the chat there. So if anyone thinks of any further questions, feel free to email those to him. Okay, it looks like that's it. Thank you again, Dallas, for that. We really appreciate it. And thanks to everyone that came out today. I hope everybody has a great afternoon.
Thanks, everyone.